All right, students, welcome to another lecture for AP World History. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about topic 4.4 on maritime empires being established during 1450 to 1750. This is going to be the first of several lectures related to topic 4.4. There's actually a lot in this topic that we need to cover. I'm going to break it up over a couple different lectures, so this one's not too long. In this lecture, I'm going to be addressing the two learning objectives, or 1.5 learning objectives. Explain the process of state building and expansion among various empires and states in the period 1450 to 1750, looking at where these countries are, who's creating these empires, and what that process looks like, as well as rivalries between some of these states. I'll also be starting to look at the second learning objective there, explain the continuities and changes in economic systems and labor systems from 1450 to 1750. We're going to focus more on the economic systems part and save the labor systems for another lecture. Let's get started. So starting with trading posts in Africa. Following increased funding for training, improved technology, and exploration from Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator, many Portuguese expeditions began to explore the coast of Africa and establish contact with the people there. We discussed the idea of God, gold, and glory as some of the reasons, the motivations for these explorers from Portugal and Spain. The goal of these explorers was definitely along the lines of God and gold in Africa. These explorers wanted to find the source of African resources like gold, ivory, and slaves that were desired by Europeans, and they hoped to be able to cut out the trans-Saharan caravans that acted as middlemen between West Africa and the Mediterranean world. Around 1471, the Portuguese first visited the Gold Coast of West Africa. Portugal would later send royal negotiators in 1482, where, kind of interestingly, as a side note, Columbus was actually a part of that expedition, as he was employed by the Portuguese at this time, although he's not in any kind of leadership role. The Portuguese delegation managed to get permission from the local king to establish a small trade fort as an outpost for Portuguese merchants and soldiers. The African king Caramansa warned the Portuguese that if they became violent, he and his people would simply move, break contact, and trade with the Portuguese and leave them to starve on the coast. Whether or not that would happen, we don't know. But as it turned out, both sides would grow wealthy from this deal. Portugal would begin purchasing what amounted to about 10% of the world's gold supply from these West African kingdoms they'd established contact with. In exchange, the Africans received goods from Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The direct contact between Europe and West Africa would lead to a decline in trade for West African states like Songhai that had relied on the trans-Saharan trade routes for much of their revenue, and lead to an increase in trade and wealth and power for coastal states in Africa. In the 1480s, Portugal would establish trade outposts and forts within the Kingdom of Benin, trading Portuguese goods like copper, textiles, glass, and guns for Benin's pepper, gold, and slaves. The slaves would be sent to sugar plantations in Portugal's Atlantic colonies of Sao Tome, just a little bit off the coast of Africa. Eventually, they'd be sent to the Americas, but we were not quite there yet. Later, in the Kingdom of Congo, in Central Africa, Congolese kings would convert to Christianity and establish close contact with the Portuguese, and later with other European powers like the Dutch, allowing them to establish trade forts and churches and even larger colonies along the coast. Congo, however, lacked the pepper resources or gold of Benin and was pushed to sell more and more slaves to maintain their trade relationship with the Portuguese. This was a profitable trade at first, but would lead to terrible consequences for much of Africa over time. One king in Congo, Afonso, tried to send a letter to his Christian brother in Portugal, the king in Portugal, asking him to end the slave trade because it had grown out of control and was depopulating the country. Portuguese slave merchants and African slave raiders terrorized the region of Congo, but the Portuguese king sent no reply and basically ghosted the kings of Congo, happy to keep receiving slaves to work in their colonies no matter the cost in Africa. We'll talk about this more in a future lecture. In the short term, the growth of these maritime networks, these ocean trade networks, were mutually beneficial and supported the growth of some African states like Congo and others like the Ashanti Empire. Again, we'll talk about a little later, by giving them access to the emerging global trade that was sparked by European exploration. But in the long run, Africa would be devastated by this trade relationship. Portugal made contact with the East African Swahili city-states in 1498. The Muslim rulers of cities like Mombasa, Sofala, and Kilwa gave Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese Catholic explorer that had painted crusader crosses on his sails, a cold welcome and were unimpressed with his trade goods. Vasco da Gama soon found reason to attack them, although one city-state, Malindi, did make an alliance with Vasco da Gama to help overcome their rivals in the region, the other East African Swahili city-states. Malindi supplied da Gama with a pilot that could help the Portuguese navigate to Calicut in India, where they hoped to arrive in the first place, and teach them about the monsoon patterns of the Indian Ocean. In 1505, da Gama, after going to Calicut and returning to India, in 1505 he returned to the Indian Ocean with a massive fleet of more than 80 ships and 7,000 men, which was still small in comparison to Zheng He's fleet that had been there 50 years earlier. This fleet immediately began to pillage its way up the coast of East Africa. Portugal established trade posts and the Cartaz system in East Africa soon after, but failed to ever fully monopolize trade in that region or any other. The East African city-states would never fully recover from the assaults and conquest of Portugal or da Gama, but the Portuguese trading post empire was only just getting started. Another exception, though, to Portuguese hostility was the Christian empire in East Africa of Ethiopia. Ethiopian rulers were in dire need of assistance in the 16th century due to the renewed aggression and expansion of some of their Islamic neighbors. They negotiated a short alliance with the Portuguese that helped them defeat Muslim forces and prolong Ethiopia's independence as an African Christian empire. Again, interestingly, it was actually Vasco da Gama's son, Christopher, that actually led the forces that helped Ethiopia, where he himself was captured and tortured to death, although Ethiopia was successfully sort of rescued from their Muslim menace at the time. The big point being there, though, that while typically Portuguese actions in the Indian Ocean were aggressive, there are exceptions to that rule, and there were some people that managed to deal with the Portuguese on peaceful terms and even ally with them as partners in that area. So there's room to argue kind of both sides to Portuguese entrance into the Indian Ocean, that it was one of peace and trade, although all the evidence leans more in the favor that it was a mission of conquest and piracy. Portugal continued their raiding and conquest in the Indian Ocean and Asia. The fleet that smashed the Swahili city-states conquered the Indian city of Goa on the west coast of India in 1510. From there, they began to harass the ports of Gujarat and the Malabar coast to the north and south of Goa, respectively. In 1511, the Portuguese captured the city of Malacca along the Strait of Malacca, the main distribution point, or what they call an entrepot, for all trade between China, Japan, India, mainland Southeast Asia, like where Vietnam or Cambodia would be today, and the Moluccas, or the Spice Islands, like Indonesia. Portugal only grew more aggressive with each victory and expanded their efforts to monopolize trade in the region by expanding the Cartaz system to more ports and cities under their control and issuing orders that only Portuguese merchants were allowed to carry spice from port to port. And remember from our discussions before, the Cartaz system required merchants to purchase a license from Portuguese traders in order to do business at Portuguese ports, of which the Portuguese controlled more and more. If people try to do business without this pass, the Portuguese would confiscate their goods and basically pirate their ships. But remember that no such pass, no such license was needed before the entry of the Portuguese into the Indian Ocean, right? They greatly disrupt the tradition of trade that had been there. Force was not always necessary, however, and the Portuguese were allowed to establish a trade fort in Macau, in China, after the local Chinese merchants and officials convinced the emperor to do so with no violence or aggression whatsoever, although that wouldn't last. By the 16th century, Japan had allowed Portuguese and Dutch merchants to trade within Japan as well, beginning with the arrival of kind of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors in 1543 that traded firearms that the Japanese soon replicated with their own armorers and began to reproduce on a large scale, sparking a kind of gunpowder revolution in Japan. This helped speed up the unification of Japan by the Tokugawa shoguns we had discussed in a previous lecture. Around that same time, along with the guns, missionaries began to enter Japan, and hundreds of thousands converted to Christianity. Soon, the English, the Dutch, and the Spanish traders were visiting Japan as well. There were around 300,000 Japanese Christians by the early 1600s, including a very few newly ordained Japanese Catholic priests. Japanese Christians grew aggressive, however, and began a kind of crusade against local Buddhist shrines and temples that were attacked and destroyed by these Japanese Christians, seeking to kind of cleanse the land of these false gods and pagan idols as their new faith saw it. Slaves were also another reason for the decline in the relationship between Europeans and the Japanese, as the Japanese rulers soon learned that the Portuguese had been purchasing Japanese people to sell as slaves in Europe. They got caught doing the same thing in China and kind of got scolded in both situations. No longer able to tolerate aggression by the newly converted Japanese Christians, the shogun ruler of Japan ended relationships with European countries and expelled almost all foreigners. Only the Dutch were allowed to continue trade at the port of Nagasaki, so long as they kept their religion to themselves. By 1617, though, a full-on persecution of Japanese Christians had begun. Beheadings, crucifixions, and forced recantations, or sort of recanting your faith, virtually eliminated all traces of Christianity from Japan in a few decades, and what was left was forced to go underground and practice in secret. By the 1630s, the Japanese had expelled nearly all foreigners, banned most foreign books, and prohibited Japanese people from traveling abroad under the threat of death. Foreign visitors were also warned not to come to Japan under the threat of death. Even shipwrecked sailors would be executed for trespassing. In 1635, the Sakoku Edict is issued, or was issued, which formalized many of these restrictions on foreigners and on traveling Japanese. Sakoku translates to something like closed country, and is the term that refers to this development in the time period in Japan where they were isolated and closed off from the outside world. Japan would remain isolated until the mid-1800s. You can see here a couple excerpts from the Sakoku Edict of 1635 that ordered the closing of Japan. Number 1, Japanese ships are strictly forbidden to leave for foreign countries. 2, no Japanese is permitted to go abroad. If there is anyone who attempts to do so secretly, he must be executed. The ship so involved must be impounded and its owner arrested, and the matter must be reported to the highest authority. If any Japanese returns from overseas after residing there, he must be put to death. If there is any place where the teachings of padres or Christians is practiced, the two of you must order a thorough investigation. He's, kind of orders to the locals. So there's several more parts of this edict here that all lead to the same thing. No Christians, no foreigners, no Japanese allowed to travel abroad and return. They were given a sort of grace period where if you happened to be outside of Japan when these laws were issued, there was about a year or two where you were given time to come back home and stay there. Because the Dutch were allowed to remain, however, in Nagasaki, Japan's isolation was not absolute. A small trickle of European scientific knowledge and technology continued to flow into Japan through the port of Nagasaki. The study of these sciences became known in Japan as Dutch studies. In Ming China, you see a similar situation, although to a much lighter degree. There's no parallel for the Sakoku period in Japan and China. Although under Ming China, following the less than profitable voyages of Zheng He, the Ming also prohibited private foreign trade, although the empire, would continue to trade with foreigners. But private merchants were no longer to just kind of go out willy-nilly and trade with whoever they wanted. The Ming Dynasty destroyed some dockyards. They allowed the massive treasure ships of Zheng He to either be destroyed or just allowed to rot in harbors in China. China limited the size of ships that could be built and began reconstructing the Great Wall instead. All steps towards isolating themselves from foreign influences, but to a much less severe degree compared to Tokugawa Japan. The Ming and Qing dynasties of China controlled and limited trade by only allowing foreigners to trade at a very small number of ports, where the exchange of goods could be heavily regulated, similar to Japan sort of only allowing merchants to come in through Nagasaki, although China was engaged in a much larger trade with several different groups of people, right? The Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, anybody that could make their way there, as well as all the Indians and Southeast Asians and so on that had never stopped trading even after the arrival of the Portuguese. The key concept here, though, is that both Japan and China adopted restrictive or isolationist trade policies in response to European expansion and aggression in the area. These here are kind of interesting to look at as well. These images, these objects on the left, these sort of flat, sort of tray-looking images, are known as fumii, which I'm probably not pronouncing correctly. Fumii translates to something like stepping on pictures, right? Or pictures for stepping on, all right? And these were essentially sort of these floor mats, I guess, that had images either of like the Virgin Mary or Jesus Christ engraved upon them. And Tokugawa Japan began to use these in the 1630s as part of their persecutions of Japanese Christians as a way to sort of discover who was Christian and who wasn't. Potential or suspected Christians would be asked to walk across these images, right? To step on the image of the Virgin Mary or Jesus, which would be something that a lot of Christians, especially kind of during this time period, would be very uncomfortable with doing. How effective this was, I'm not sure, but there are a lot of these, and this is something that was fairly common in Tokugawa Japan as a means of finding who was Christian and who wasn't. On the right-hand side there is a Buddhist statue, but with a secret hidden cross or crucifix on the back, so that people could continue to practice Christianity in secret while putting forward this display of Buddhism or Shintoism, some of the religions, officially allowed in Tokugawa Japan. But kind of neat there. European rivalries, fueled by political, economic, or religious motives, shaped the expansion of a lot of these empires, these maritime empires as well. Several powers established trading posts in India, for example, that would eventually come into conflict with each other. In India, you could find the British East India Company, or the EIC, which had begun a commercial relationship with the Mughal Empire in the 1600s, the 17th century. Portugal, as we've already mentioned, controlled coastal trading posts in the southwestern state of Goa and several others along the coast of India. And France controlled Pondicherry, a city in the southeastern state of Tamil Nadu, the sort of most southern part of India. Over time, Portugal's influence in the area would decline with the arrival of more powerful competitors like the English or the Dutch that would kind of drive them from a lot of their trading posts and take those spots over. Through the EIC, the East India Company, the British established a foothold of trade forts on the coast of India, but lacked the power to really go toe-to-toe with the Mughal Empire at this time, although they would be kind of more than capable a century or two after this. Over the decades, the British would exploit tension between Hindus and Muslims to gain control of more territory from the declining Mughal Empire, siding with one group or the other and being promised, control of a little bit of extra territory or this fort if they helped win this battle or that battle. And slowly, their control over Indian territory expanded more and more. The 7 Years' War is something that's technically out of the scope of this time period, but is something we will talk about in our next unit, but relates to this global competition during this time period. The 7 Years' War was a global conflict. Some historians say the first sort of world war, although on a much smaller scale than the world wars we're used to talking about, that took place across Europe, Asia, North America, South America, and Africa, across 5 different continents. Essentially, the war was a struggle for global supremacy between Britain and France, with Britain winning in most areas, driving the French out of North America and out of India as well, and leaving those areas for themselves. Britain would, as we know, lose their colonial holdings in North America to the American Revolution, which would lead them to sort of double down on their empire in India. We'll talk more about that later, but this is some explanation as to how these empires in Asia, these European maritime empires in Asia, begin to take form and transfer hands from one group to another. All right, so while much of the conquest and exploration done by Spain and Portugal was financed by the royal treasury itself, sort of directly by the government, nations like Britain or the new Republic of the Netherlands lacked that kind of financial power to be able to fund these very expensive journeys on their own at first. And they developed new ways to finance colonization, trade, and exploration through the use of joint stock companies, some of the most famous of which were the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, although there were many, many, many of these that were involved in the slave trade and the transport of goods around the world at this time. The British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company were organizations that were given government charters, basically kind of official government authority, to establish trade relationships with foreign countries, forts, to engage in military maneuvers when needed, and generally to basically act independently of the government with the authority of the government. But these were also private trading companies owned by individuals or groups of individuals, not the government themselves. Although they had very strong ties to the government, very similar to modern corporations, because these are basically modern corporations, the first modern corporations. These endeavors were organized as what we're going to be calling joint stock companies, where many investors were able to help raise money and share or spread risk by buying stock in the company. So literally, people would jointly or together purchase stock in these companies. This dispersed the risk to investors. Instead of the government, for example, having to foot the bill for a risky voyage that might get destroyed by a storm, attacked by pirates, lost at sea, or some other disaster where they would end up losing all the funding they had put forth, joint stock companies instead allowed many investors, from maybe a few dozen or so to hundreds or maybe even thousands, to invest in these journeys, spreading the risk among many investors instead of a single rich person or the government itself. This made it a lot easier for investors to be willing to take the risk in the first place, as in the event of one of these disasters, they would only lose what they had contributed as their investment, not the massive amounts of money these journeys required, not to mention the price of the ships and material themselves. Over time, these companies would grow in power and be granted trade monopolies, war powers. They'd be allowed to govern conquered people on behalf of the nation or the crown, which is what in India, the East India Company is going to be doing up until pretty late into the 1800s. It is actually this corporation that is controlling and running things and creating the laws and keeping order in the British Empire in India, not the British government itself. It's this corporation sort of acting on behalf of the British government in India that is kind of giving shape to their empire there. These companies did much of the conquering and ruling for Britain and the Netherlands, or the Dutch, in the Indian Ocean, not the governments themselves, right? That's the kind of key takeaway. So for example, in 1603 CE, the Dutch, through the Dutch East India Company, conquered many of the spice-producing islands of the Moluccas, or the Spice Islands as they were called, gaining basically a monopoly on some of the most valuable spices, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, where they ended up sort of being able to charge outrageous amounts of money for those spices. After killing, starving, and enslaving the local populations, Dutch people were imported as sort of the planters, the controllers of these plantations, and the locals were turned into slave workers, or sometimes slaves were purchased from elsewhere and imported into the Spice Islands. But the Dutch monopoly over nutmeg, cloves, and mace allowed them to charge 14 to 17 times the price of what those goods had previously been going for. This was very profitable for the Dutch. The British, who kind of missed out on the opportunity to conquer those Spice Islands, couldn't at first conquer land empires like the Mughals in India. In 1614, however, the British East India Company sort of bought or bribed Mughal rulers for access to trading posts on the Indian coast, which was a little bit nicer than what the Portuguese had done to get access to their trading ports. They also used local sepoys, or Indian soldiers. Let me kind of skip ahead on the lecture here. They also used local sepoys, or Indian soldiers or mercenaries, that they trained and equipped with European firearms to supplement their small military and East India Trading Company forces in that area, right? There was never more than, even at the peak of the British Empire in India, they say never more than about 10,000 British people in India. That the vast majority of the people providing security were local Indians themselves, recruited into the East India Company's sort of private military and eventually working for the British Empire in India. Eventually, the East India Company's control in India would evolve into outright colonial domination as they managed to conquer more and more of the Indian subcontinent from the Mughal Empire. Now let's turn our attention to the Americas for a little bit and look at the shapes of states and empires there. I'll kind of review a little bit of some stuff we've talked about or read before. The fall of the Aztec Empire is what is really going to sort of give shape to the Spanish Empire in the Americas. At the time, Central America included somewhere between 15 to 25 million people before the arrival of the Spanish, depending on kind of which history book you read. Hernan Cortez, the conquistador that's going to conquer the Aztecs, arrived in Mexico in 1519 and would complete his conquest of the Aztec Empire in 1521. After his success, he established the colony of New Spain on the mainland of the Americas. The success of the Spanish, who were hopelessly outnumbered, owes much to the various tribute states, the conquered subjects of the Aztecs, agreeing to fight on the side of the Spanish. Early engagements between the Aztecs and Cortez did not end well for Cortez and his men until they recruited many thousands of the rivals of the Aztecs to help them. The effects of the Great Dying, the diseases that swept through the New World from the Old, were also a major factor in the ability of the Spanish and other Europeans to conquer the Americas. Native populations were reduced by 90%, and their ability to mount significant resistance was greatly reduced with each passing year. Following his conquest of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, Cortés would tear down the massive temples and buildings there stone by stone, and instead build on top of it the new capital of Mexico City on the ruins of the Aztec capital, which is maybe a little bit symbolic there. Further south, Francisco Pizarro would begin the conquest of the other major empire in the Americas, the Incan Empire, culminating in 1532 with the conquest of Peru and the capture and eventual murder or execution of the leader of the Inca, the Sapa Inca Atahualpa. A smallpox epidemic, though, had arrived in the lands of the Inca before the conquistadors got there. Smallpox, though, came from the Spanish, but had spread from Native American tribe to Native American tribe until it arrived at the borders of the Incan Empire and then made its way from city to city throughout the Incan Empire. This smallpox epidemic devastated the Inca Empire and resulted in the death of its emperor, which in turn led to a civil war between his sons, of which Atahualpa was the victor. Pizarro arrived just as this civil war ended, which was just a terrible moment for the Inca to have to deal with this new threat of a Spanish invasion. With only 168 men, even though they were armed with guns and cannons and horses and steel, they were massively outnumbered again against the Inca. So Pizarro applied the same tactics as Cortés had with the Aztecs. He recruited disgruntled commanders and tributary states of the Incan Empire that helped him in battle against their old rulers. After Pizarro captured the Sapa Inca Atahualpa, he had him pay a ransom for his release. The ransom was to fill a large room with gold and two other similarly sized rooms with silver. This ended up amounting to something like 13,000 pounds of gold and 26,000 pounds of silver. This is one of the largest ransoms in history, and it made Pizarro and his men incredibly rich, as conquistadors almost operated sort of like joint stock companies, right? These men were investors in the outcomes of this expedition, and they were going to profit according to a certain share of these profits, right? I think the lowest paid soldier in Pizarro's expedition received something like 45 pounds of gold. I mean, something that would be close to about $500,000 in today's money. So a pretty big paycheck for this expedition. Pizarro himself made out like a bandit, like an actual bandit, right? This is one of the largest ransoms ever paid in history, and one of the saddest, because promising the release of their ruler Atahualpa if they filled this large room with gold, the Inca were dismayed to find out that the Spanish ended up executing him through strangulation anyway after the ransom was collected. By 1572, so this conquest begins in the 1530s, but would continue for several decades to be concluded in 1572 when the Spaniards completed their final conquest of the Inca Empire and established a new capital at Lima in what is today Peru. An earlier event that kind of helps highlight the rivalry between Spain and Portugal and helps us understand the formation of maritime empires during this era as well is the Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal. Essentially, Spain and Portugal were competing over who would get more land in the Americas and kind of elsewhere as well, as it was still being explored by Europeans. And the church stepped in to prevent war, or sort of the Spanish and Portuguese kind of went to the church, the Catholic Church, and the Pope to get him to negotiate a treaty between them. From this treaty negotiated through the church, Spain would end up reserving all the lands to the west of a line of longitude, basically, that went through eastern South America, which you can kind of see to the right of that red line. This was sort of the original line of demarcation. Spain got everything to the west of that, which is basically all of the Americas, right? Was something that they were allowed. And you can see Portugal would be left with just that little tip of what is today Brazil. But it also gave Portugal control of everything sort of to the east of that line, right? So Africa, the Indian Ocean, like all that stuff was sort of the domain of Portugal. Then later on, as more of the Americas were mapped and people came to realize that these were not just a few sort of scattered islands, but a giant wall of continents, the line was moved to where that red line is to the west, creating the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, and essentially helping to explain why Portugal colonized Brazil in the Americas and not much else, and why Spain never really ends up expanding into much of Africa or the Indian Ocean, except for their colony in the Philippines. To wrap this lecture up, let's look at the exchange of silver and the growth of the global economy, right? The changes that take place to the global economy as a part of topic 4.4. Spain had discovered major deposits of silver, not the gold that they were hoping for, in the 1530s and 1540s in their new American empire. While there was gold, there was a whole lot more silver to be found in the Americas. In 1545, an enormous mountain of silver was discovered in Potosi, Peru, or what is today Peru, and later another large find was found in Zacatecas, Mexico. In South America, Spain made use of the Incan Mita system of labor tribute. If you remember, under the Mita system of the Inca, all able-bodied men owed the government a tribute of labor each year. The Spanish just continued this tradition after conquering the Incan Empire and used the workers to mine silver. Originally, the Spanish extracted the silver from the ore through the process of smelting, okay? Basically crushing the ore up into powder, heating it up to high temperatures with wood and coal and things like that to sort of melt out the silver from the stone. This worked, but it deforested large sections of the region and had this terrible environmental impact. A later method used mercury, right? Quicksilver, the silvery liquid mercury, to chemically extract the silver without the need to smelt it. I don't really know how that works, but apparently that's how they did it. But mercury, as you might know, is toxic and had terrible effects on the Indians performing these extractions and on the water and environment in the areas of the mines. American silver increased the European money supply, or capital, as it will come to be referred to soon. This additional cash was great for the mercantilist kingdoms of Europe, and would promote expanded commerce and later industrialization throughout Europe, all things that we'll talk about in later lectures. American silver, though, became the first global commodity and helped create the first truly global exchange or global economy. It went like this. Silver mined in Peru or Mexico crossed the Pacific, all right? Silver mined in Peru or Mexico crossed the Pacific on Spanish ships known as galleons to land in the port of Manila in the Philippines. In Manila, the silver was used to purchase Asian goods like silk, spices, and porcelain. The Asian goods went back across the Pacific to Mexico in South America, and from there on to Spain and into mainland Europe, where it might finance wars or be used to pay for goods that would be used to buy slaves in Africa that would be sent to the Americas, and you'd get this sort of process continued over again. The silver in Manila typically made its way into China, whose rapidly growing economy demanded a larger and larger supply of this new currency of silver after they'd kind of abandoned their paper currency due to inflation and switched over to silver. China consumed and used so much silver that, as we've talked about before, it became the method with which peasants were required to pay their taxes instead of through the old tributes of labor, kind of like the Inca Mita system. Peasants in China helped manufacture more products like silk and porcelain to export for ever more silver, which ended up back in China. So much silver flowed between Manila and Mexico and Spain that the Spanish began to move their galleons in convoys with warships to protect them from pirates. We talked about Francis Drake, for example, who was, a British explorer and also British pirate that raided a lot of these ships. This wealth would increase the comfort of the elite in the Americas and increase urbanization there as well, especially in these mining communities. In Europe, it would fund, as we said, many of Spain's wars during this time, but would also lead to devastating inflation as the amount of silver grew to an enormous degree. Up until recently, something like, I think like 60% of all the world's silver at this time was coming from that one mountain in Potosi, Bolivia, or in, what was Peru back then. So that concludes our look at the process of state building between 1450, 1750 of these maritime empires, as well as some of the changes in the economic system during this time, such as the growth of this global economy. I hope that helps you guys kind of connect some of the things you've been reading about, and I'll talk to you again real soon. Thanks a lot.